Do you have your tickets to Wicked for Good yet?
No.
No?
I do not. I don't buy them ahead of time. I know I should. We have planned to go. So I think I told you in one of the emails that Wicked actually is an interesting issue in the disability community.
Yeah.
Because, and spoiler alerts, in case
Big
this
spoiler
makes it
alert. When's
in-
this going to go live? I hope people have seen the movie.
in case it makes it in the second act of we've seen the original Broadway show, her sister,
Nessa Rose.
Mm-hmm. She put on the shoes.
Yep.
And she gets up and walks.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a really big no-no
Mm-hmm.
in the disability community.
Mm-hmm.
It's extremely ableist.
Yeah.
So the director of the movie has changed that part because actually the actor playing Nessa Rose in the movie, unlike on the stage, had a disability. She uses the wheelchair that she did. So having her get up and walk is another thing that's gonna happen.
Yeah.
So they've reworked that part of the movie, which is very much appreciated in the disability community.
By the time this episode goes live, probably folks who are like you and me, who love Wicked and will go see it, will probably have seen it. But yes, in Act 2 of the musical, Nessa Rose, who is in a wheelchair, uses a wheelchair, she gets those ruby slippers that we are so familiar with from Wizard of Oz. She puts them on, and now she's able to walk. And that being incredibly ableist. And so we'll see what they do in the movie. It's pretty exciting that they are taking that feedback and learning how to best demonstrate what it means for an actress and for this character who uses a wheelchair, what that would look like for her.
Right, because having actors without disabilities portray characters with disabilities is really frowned upon in the disability community. It's been really long in the disability community when creators recognize, please don't do that.
Yeah, right. And it has been so prevalent in film and television of folks who do not have the disability that they are portraying, and how problematic that is to do that.
Exactly. So, yay!
So, good job, John Chu. Good job, director.
Good job, John Chu.
For doing. So we'll see what happens, and we'll see if how we feel about it. The change.
Exactly.
If it is, dare I say, for good. Oh. You're listening to New Hampshire Has Issues, and I am your host, Liz Canada. I was so honored and excited when Pat reached out to me about a podcast that she works on called That's Inclusive, which is the podcast from the New Hampshire Council on Developmental Disabilities. And she emailed me and, referenced that I like musicals and she likes musicals, a little this and that. I was like, Pat, why don't you come on my podcast and talk about disability rights? And so here she is. And we spend a lot of this episode talking about housing. And I feel like housing, might I say, is the talk of the town right now. And I really feel like we're just barely scratching the surface of the issue of housing. So I'm so appreciative of Pat coming on and talking with me. If you would like to support the show, you can visit patreon.com/NHHasIssues. If you, like Pat, might have an idea for an episode, send me an email, newhampshireHasIssues@gmail.com. It is December. It is cold. It is snowy. It is dark at 2 p.m. Please take care of yourself. Listen to the podcast, laugh at some jokes here or there, and I'm going to do my best to get you one more episode before 2026, and then we'll be back with our regularly scheduled programming. All right, I will pass it over to me. Welcome to New Hampshire Has Issues, the podcast that dares to ask, what learnings are we going to do today on this podcast from the issues we've already talked about? What can I learn, and what are we going to learn together? My guest today is Patricia Vincent-Piet.
Very good.
Very good. Are you sure? So my guest today is Patricia Vincent-Piet, who is a disability rights advocate And a listener of the show knows enough about the show to know that I love musicals. And when we connected on email, promised me we would talk about musicals on this episode, which is great. I'm so glad that you are here, Patricia. Thank you. Do you go by Patricia or Pat? I feel like I've seen Pat.
You can call me Pat.
Okay. Do you have a tagline for me for our episode together? New Hampshire Has Issues, the podcast that dares to ask.
Why does New Hampshire seem to hate me and, and people and all its residents with disabilities? Why? Why did it seem like they're out to get us?
Hard-hitting tagline on the podcast today. That is for sure. That's
Maybe
great.
a little too serious.
But the question is, why are the policies and the practices and the laws in our state, why are they in such a way that cause harm to folks with disabilities? Why is this how New Hampshire is behaving?
And why have recently it feels like they're going out of their way to disenfranchise people?
Let's get into it, Pat, because that is the question that I have as well. So why don't we start with a little bit of background about yourself?
I have a relatively mild version of cerebral palsy. So growing up, I could what they call mask pretty well. I mean, the emphasis with therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy was let's normalize this person so they can have a typical life. And I discovered at some point, that just wasn't gonna happen. But you can only disguise this voice so much. You can only disguise my wobble so much. And so I lived most of my life outside the disability community, just trying to fit in and be quote-unquote normal. When I went to school, I was in a typical classroom. They called it mainstreaming at the time. I never interacted with disabled kids. I was always in completely inclusive classrooms. I never knew anyone with a disability.
Wow.
Until my late 20s. I mean, I had some interaction. I had some interaction in college, but I went to college about the time the ADA passed. And I went to a small private college. There weren't many people with disabilities in my college. So I ended up actually dating someone who was really interested in my identity as a person with a disability. And to me, I had never identified that way. And so when he was very interested in that, I started getting interested in it too. And I discovered something called the disability culture and the disability rights movement. I went on to marry someone who was completely outside of that and spent time in a sort of weird place for a few years. But then when I after I got divorced and came back to New Hampshire, I was trying to create a life for myself. And someone suggested, why don't you get in touch with disability organizations? Maybe they can help you find your niche employment-wise. And when I did, it opened up a whole new world, including how I met my current husband, who has cerebral palsy as well, who needs support for most of his, what we call ADLs, activities of daily living. So even though Jim has a master's degree and worked for the state for 20-some-odd years, he still needs help with getting out of bed, eating, using the bathroom. We're both part of this disability culture, and yet we experience it very differently.
Yeah.
He went to a segregated school. He went to Quatchie Mountain. He grew up entirely around other kids with disabilities. I grew up not knowing any kid with disabilities, and so we realized sort of early on that our experiences really brought a lot to the discussion about disability
Hmm.
and disability rights here in New Hampshire. So I got involved with the New Hampshire Council on Developmental Disabilities. I worked for Grants Independent Living for a while, and just got to know a lot of people in the disability community here in New Hampshire. I was working at a real estate agent at the time. I started to dig into why is it so hard for people with disabilities to find accessible and affordable housing. What are the funding streams? How do they work? How do they add to the problem? How do they help the problem? And different theories on inclusion from the leaders of the disability rights movement. People like Ed Roberts, who was a guy who lived in an iron lung and started the independent living movement. And Justin Dart, he's often called the father of the ADA. He had polio.
Can I ask you about that, actually, ADA? Because you mentioned this
Sure.
earlier. You said that you went to college, I believe, and when they were passing the ADA.
Yes.
So maybe a simple question, as simple as this can be, what is the ADA? What does it stand for and what does it mean?
American with Disabilities Act. So it was an act that passed in 1990. It was signed into law by George H.W. Bush. And basically it was a civil rights law for people with disabilities, right? Ensuring that we had access to spaces and programs, employment, housing, transportation, everything that most people took for granted that you just did. You just got on the bus. You just went out and got a job. You just got into the store or the theater. And until then, a lot of people with disabilities didn't do any of those things.
Right. That's the early 90s. You just said that it was passed in the early 90s.
1990. Yeah, that late.
That is not that long ago. That is so recent.
No. And the final version that passed was lacking, extremely lacking, as far as the disability community was concerned. Right, a lot of things got taken out that people with disabilities really needed. There have been attempts after attempts to roll it back.
Right.
Right, the minimal accessibility just is too much for so many people. And so they're constantly trying to roll it back.
I sort of introduced you as being a disability rights advocate. When we talk about that phrase, disability rights, because it seems like, the ADA passed in 1990, not that long ago. Wild how recent that was. What does disability rights actually mean, maybe in daily life for folks with disabilities?
It means people with disabilities get to do what everyone else takes for granted. Like, I went to college, 4 years of college. Not great grades, but pretty good grades.
A classic college student. I did the grades. I got them.
I got out and was unable to find employment because no one trusted me to do the thing that I had just spent 4 years and thousands of dollars learning how to do. Because they heard the speech impediments and they saw the wobble when I walk, and they thought, yeah, we're not going there. The ADA empowered my husband to work for 25 years, first for the university and then for the state of New Hampshire, and get the support that he needed to use his mind in a way that he was capable of using it. But also simple things. Like prior to the ADA, a lot of streets did not have curb cuts.
Yeah, right.
Most public buildings had steps at every entrance. And there was no accessible bathroom. There was no way for blind or visually impaired people to understand what's going on around them. Right now, if you go to crosswalk, you press the little button that says, wait,
You're right.
and then it beeps when it's coming close to the do not cross. Well, that's because of the idea that so that people who are blind or visually impaired don't get run over by a truck.
Right. Just that we're asking for the basic things. I would like to be able to cross the street without getting hit by a car. Basic things here.
I can cross the street on my own. Just don't make me take my life in my hands.
Yeah, right.
To do so. Now when you go to the movies, you can get, forget what it's called, but a device that will put captions up for you.
Yeah.
That will caption the movies. I mean, before the ADA, people were deaf didn't go to the movies.
Right.
Because nothing was captioned. All sorts of big and little things that make it possible. But Jim and I go out to restaurants a lot. Most of those restaurants 30, 40 years ago, he would not have been able to get into. It would not have been accessible to him. There would have been steps at every entrance.
Right.
And still, I have all sorts of stories of older buildings where people think they are meeting the minimum requirements of accessibility. I've been to so many places where they have like a ramp, but at the top of the ramp, there's like a 3-inch lip. Yeah.
Whoopsie daisy on that one. Wow.
Yeah.
You mentioned the curb cuts, and it's like, I've seen some projects around the state, like playgrounds that have become more accessible, where instead of using like the wood chips on the ground, there's the different material so that young people who use wheelchairs or have mobility, that wood chips would not be helpful to be able to move on. They're able to do that. And it's like, I think some people think that if you're making changes in your town or community for folks with disabilities, that it only benefits folks with disabilities. It's like everybody benefits. You got mom walking with a stroller. That's helpful with the curb.
Yes.
That helps lots of people. Our boys have talked about like the playgrounds that have changed, and they're like, it's so great. More kids get to be here. That's pretty cool. Like, that's really great for everybody.
And it's safer for the kids who can walk, the kids who don't need the accessibility.
Yeah.
Just a safer playground.
Imagine having safer playgrounds for the kids.
You need someone who really knows what they're doing to do it.
Yeah.
Because I think, too, that we're going to talk about housing. There, and I don't mean to call out the housing authority here in Concord, and this was like over 20 years ago. But I had gone to one of their developments. Friend of ours actually had the accessible unit in their development. She didn't need the unit, but it was available. So she was like, oh, great, I finally live somewhere accessible. You guys can come visit me. What we didn't think about, so there was no curb cut to get from the parking lot. The unit was perfectly wheelchair accessible. There was no curb cut between the parking lot and the unit. Jim had to go all the way down to the end, like a block away to the end of the street.
Oh my God.
And go out into traffic to get up on the sidewalk.
Oh my God.
And so it's really funny what people...
I love that you say funny, as if that's the word to describe that. It doesn't sound funny so much as, I don't know, horrifying, terrifying, ridiculous, whatever the words are.
I mean, that happens a lot. We made this accessible. Well, no, you did not really. You missed something.
So housing is your wheelhouse. That's how you've described it. Is like, this is the thing that, you're most expert in. I don't know how to say it, but like this is your thing, right? So I heard you talk about independent living and housing, and a question that you sort of prompted as well is, why is it so difficult to find housing in New Hampshire for folks with disabilities? What's going on, Pat? Tell me what's going on here.
So that's a complicated story.
What?
So there are two laws that cover accessible housing. They're both federal laws. There's Section 504 of the Rehabilitative Act. Most people know that, have heard of that connected to education. Sierra had a 504 plan.
Yep.
But Section 504 of the Rehabilitative Act is actually one paragraph at the very end of the Rehabilitative Act, and all it said was all federally funded programs and buildings have to be made basically accessible to people with disabilities. The act passed in 1973. 1977 rolled around and it still has not been implemented. The fight to force the federal government to implement Section 504 was one of the most remarkable moments or fights in disability history. When I talk about disability history, and I talk about disability culture, one aspect of that is the history of the disability rights movement. That a lot of people don't even know that this history exists. So when they finally, in the early 80s, started to put in place rules around federally funded housing accessibility, all new federally funded housing had to make 10% of their units accessible. The other law that affects accessible housing is the American with Disabilities Act. After the ADA passed, that 10% requirement was passed to all housing providers. The problem with that was that it was only for multifamily developments over 6 units and larger, and it didn't cover townhomes. So single-family homes, townhomes, and multifamily buildings with 5 units or less did not have to have any type of accessibility. Now, two things happened after this. Right around the time it passed, which was shortly after the housing market in New Hampshire crashed.
Oh boy.
And people were building. So, yay, we had this brand new law. No one was building housing. So if you look, a lot of the multifamily housing, the larger multifamily housing developments, are either built in the 80s or they're brand new. If they're brand new market rate multifamily housings, they are expensive. So you may have the accessibility, but you don't have the affordability. And so when buildings started to ramp back up in the early 2000s, what were they building? Single families, townhomes, and a lot of duplexes. None of those housing options had to be made accessible. So we end up with far fewer than 10% of our housing units being basically accessible. One thing I often get from housing providers when I talk about this, though, is, well, we build accessible housing, but we don't have anybody with disabilities to fill the housing. There's a couple of problems with this, right? One is that most people with disabilities don't drive, which is a big issue. So if you're going to put up housing, it needs to be walkable to things like employment and shopping and healthcare, or they need to have public transportation available. So you build this nice place out in the middle of nowhere, but people with disabilities aren't going to come live there because then they are stuck out in the middle of nowhere.
New Hampshire, I'm going to take a controversial stance here, But New Hampshire isn't known for its public transportation in the
No, it is
States.
not. No, it is
No.
not.
So you're saying that one of the issues here is that when these folks are going to build new housing, they're saying, well, if we build accessible units, people won't move here who have disabilities. And the counterpoint to that is, well, that's because there are all these other services that are missing that
Exactly.
make it livable to be in that community in the first place. Like you need to have
Yes.
a way to get to the grocery store, get to the doctor's office, to be able to be near the services and employment as well, a place to work when you live there.
And if you need support to get out of bed in the morning, to eat, to do all the things that people do, you need to have other affordable housing in the area so that people providing you the services can live within a reasonable distance of you. Because when you're an hourly worker, if you're having to travel an hour each way to work for someone for a couple of hours and then travel another hour to work for someone else who needs a couple of I mean, so it's the location of the housing too, which so a lot of people think the answer to that then is supported housing. So there's a program called Section 811 housing,
Yep.
which is federally funded housing specifically for people with disabilities, and it often provides services as well. The problem with this housing is it's segregated, and when you tie services and housing together, so if you're receiving your personal care services from the same organization that's providing your housing, you're kind of stuck with both. When Jim and I met, he was living in Section 811 housing. It's not designed for families, but sometimes it feels like the assumption is that people with disabilities, people who need services, are going to remain single and alone
Single and
for their
alone
entire
forever.
life. Right, so they only need, one bedroom tiny apartment. We've created this little segregated enclave, so we've done it, but not considering the fact that, well, they might get married and have children and
Hot take. People with disabilities, they're people. Turns out
yes,
they're humans. They're human people.
wild. So Jim and I had my condo, or I had a detached condo, none of which had to be made accessible because they were detached condos when they were built. We ended up having to move into this really expensive market rate apartment that was taking up like over half our income a month
Oh my God.
because we made too much money to qualify for subsidized housing. But most market rate housing that was reasonably priced was not accessible.
Make too much money for the subsidized housing that would be accessible, but having to live somewhere else can afford the place, but it is not accessible. So what does New Hampshire do, Pat? Like, how is New Hampshire helping? Does New Hampshire help? What is New Hampshire? Does New Hampshire help? Is it hurting? Like, what should New Hampshire be doing? What are they doing?
So a big thing that would be really helpful, and it seems like that's happening now, is that communities are allowing larger multifamily projects. So if you have larger multifamily projects, 10% of them are going to be accessible. Again, it's a question of where you're locating them and are you ensuring that either they have public transportation or are located close enough to supports and services that someone can access it without transportation. When we talk about the Section 811 housing, so that's segregated housing just for people with disabilities, instead of having that program, because people with disabilities are the only minority that it's legal to segregate us, right? You don't have segregated housing programs for any of the minority. So can we take the money that we're spending on Section 811 housing and use that to subsidize units in more inclusive housing? I think that's being thought of, how that can
Because that's
happen.
federal money, right? The Section 811 would be federal,
Right.
a
So
federal program.
I'm assuming that it would be complicated, but I also have my reservation about segregating people based on income, which is what we're doing right now. Right, you're either living in subsidized housing. There's also vouchers. So I know that there's a voucher program that people can use
Is that
to
Section
rent
8?
to Section 8.
Yeah.
That's why I'm
Yeah.
okay.
I was
So,
thinking the same thing as like,
uh,
I think there's
I'm
Section
like,
8, but now there's
wait,
Section 811.
so here I am pretending like I know all this about housing, and I'm like, no, I don't. So Section 8 housing,
Yep.
it has the voucher program so that someone with a disability who qualifies for Section 8 housing could take that money, and that was intended to stop segregating people based on income. And so is there a way to do that with Section 811 housing?
Because Section 811, you're saying, is like the housing that is built is segregated from folks who do not have disabilities. So it's
Right,
specifically for folks with disabilities, those units
right.
entirely, like a building that has that or is
Yes.
all just Section 811 versus Section 8 housing is voucher. You would receive funding to help support your rent where you
Yes.
might live, if I'm understanding it correctly.
So some Section 8 is project-based, so developers can get Section 8 funding to develop affordable housing, and then the Section 8 funding is tied to the units that are built, and then the Section 8 voucher program with the Section 8 funding is tied to the individual, which allowed for more choice for people with low incomes.
So those programs are federal programs, like that's federal funding that goes towards these housing initiatives, let's say. What does the state of New Hampshire do? Like, does the state have programs that are there to help fund new housing development and to ensure that we have public transportation? I'm going to laugh at that own question, but is the state doing things specifically in this space?
No, the state did not. Now,
Oof.
in the past, the state has had some grant funding available, but there's no predictable funding stream that you can tap into.
What a great phrase. Predictable funding stream. Like, imagine if things were predictable for
I know.
folks. Yeah.
Wild. Yeah. No, there, as far as I'm aware, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, there is no state funding, no state dollars go to housing. I think the only time state dollars have gone to housing, it's been in the form of grants or temporary funding, like gap type funding.
From what I can tell, if I've read the news correctly, housing is a big issue in New Hampshire. Housing is a big issue for everyone in New
Yes.
Hampshire. And so what I'm hearing you say, Pat, is that it is an even bigger issue for folks who need accessible housing because
Right.
that is even more limited than the housing, which is already extremely limited in this state.
Yes. Yeah.
Oof.
Accessible, affordable, and integrated. So a lot of people they look to things like group homes or the Section 11 housing. Again, group homes are okay, but it's somewhere that you would want to live. If it's a place that you would not want to live, people living in these group home situations, they really don't have a lot of say over their daily routines. They often don't have a lot of say over who is providing their services. And again, we want to avoid housing people in some place that's going to end up being that place, right? You walk by the house and it's that place.
That place. Italicized. That place. Right.
Where those people live. It's not what you and I would find acceptable housing options. And so the more we can create truly inclusive, accessible, and affordable, which affordability is. I'm not even.
I know. I feel like I wrote down something you said. Accessibility. You need accessibility and you need affordability. It can't just be accessible. It also needs to be affordable.
It does. It needs to be affordable and it needs to be integrated. And people with disabilities deserve to live in their...
with everyone else, with their community.
Right, and not off in their own little enclaves. And sometimes I think we're setting young people with disabilities up. Right, we've worked so hard to keep them in their own communities, with their own families, and then they graduate, and they have to go live in that place over there, because we have no room for them. Or they have to stay at home as adults. They have to live with their parents indefinitely. When I think about the ideal situation for housing, I think about universal design.
Oh, explain that. What's universal design?
Universal design is creating spaces that are usable to the largest number of people. So it doesn't meet entirely accessible standards, but it's usable to most people. So there is an entrance that has no step. There are bathroom facilities that you can get to and use safely and comfortably. There's the opportunity for accessible communication for people who are deaf or hard of hearing or blind or visually impaired. So when we design a space, we don't put a step at the top of
the ramp. The big finale of the ramp is not a step. That is not the best way to go about that.
Right. So when we're creating housing, how can we create as many units in the development that have wider doors, a no-step entrance, a bathroom that's accessible, a bedroom on the lower floor, so that anyone can live there? How do we make as much new housing as possible that way? And another issue with housing also is, according to the law, if someone with a disability wants to rent a unit that doesn't meet their needs, they can rent that unit, and the landlord has to allow them at their own expense, at the tenant's expense, to make the unit accessible to them. Right, so when Jim and I first moved into that really expensive apartment, it was basically accessible, but it didn't have a roll-in shower. So we had to take out a loan to put a roll-in shower into an apartment that we were renting. Technically, the landlord could have forced us at our own expense to return the bathroom to the way it was. Yeah, that's the rule.
Is that a state law or is that a...
No, that's allowable by the ADA rules.
Oh
That's
my
the idea.
God.
Yeah. No, I had to warn someone who he had put in a stair lift in his unit, and I'm like, you do know that when you move out of here, your landlord can force you to pay to have that taken out. And he was not aware.
Wow.
Now, fortunately, in my experience, a lot of landlords don't,
Right.
because our apartment had 2 bathrooms. The roll-in shower, I'm sure, was not a problem. It had a bathtub in the other bathroom,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, they could have forced us to put it back.
Holy smokes.
Yeah,
I mean, it's accessible housing. It's affordable housing. It's the impact financially moving in to make your space accessible if it is not already. That's a high cost. It is potentially putting it back the way it was, the financial cost there, if the landlord forces that issue. And something that you mentioned before is also like for folks who need in-home care in some way, it's making sure that those individuals have housing nearby and
exactly.
affordable housing nearby because they are
Yes,
often not paid they don't make huge salaries. And so they need to
right,
have housing that they can live in and commute to be able to support folks in all this housing that we're talking about.
right.
It's a lot of layers here, Pat. It's a lot of
A lot
layers
of
just
layers.
for
It's like
housing.
it's like a really yucky cake.
Yeah, yeah, it
It's a
is.
really gross cake.
A terrible onion where you just keep
From
peeling it
an
back and you're like, there's
onion.
there's no
Yes.
usable part of this onion, is it? It's pretty bad. Time to get a new onion
It's
entirely.
gone bad. And so I mean, the one way that we can is to change that law, right? Is to make it so that people with disabilities, if they do move in and change it, they don't have to change it back. And I understand, small landlords, if you're putting in an accessibility feature that's gonna make it unusable for another tenant, but there must be some way to fund modifications and the retraction of those modifications without taking it out of the income of people for whom their income is already pretty limited.
Pat, we didn't even cover 90% of the questions that I had for you in advance because this topic alone has
Yeah,
so much depth to it. I had a housing episode with Nick Taylor, and I had a homelessness episode with Erica and Lauren from Families in Transition. And housing is such a huge issue in New Hampshire. And, my tagline at the beginning, jokesy but not, was like, what am I going to learn? I'm learning about so many of the layers of housing beyond like the quick headlines of we don't have enough housing. Like there's a lot of depth here that kind of
right.
terrifies me. What could someone do to make a positive impact here? Like if I live in a town and I'm like, okay, I listened to this podcast. We definitely don't have public transportation. I don't know if we're building any new housing anytime soon, but I don't know how much accessible housing we have. What could a listener do to make a positive impact?
You could start by, perhaps a town could have a fund that supported people who needed to move into an inaccessible unit to make that unit accessible and meet their needs. When you're looking at new housing being built, so there's a lot of discussion around auxiliary living units. So people who have single family homes are adding like a small apartment to their homes a lot of times for their kids or family or friends who can't find. Can we look at requiring some accessibility in those auxiliary units or some sort of financial incentive to make these units more accessible. Can we look at the availability of transportation in our community and how we can create more public transportation, which would
Yeah.
benefit not just people with disabilities, but would benefit the
Everyone,
entire
all of the people,
community.
everybody
Right,
benefits.
right.
Yeah.
More public transportation options. Yeah, and when people are talking about building segregated accessible housing, are we really asking the right questions to make sure that housing is still a part of the community, right? So that the people in that unit on that street feel just as much a part of the community as the family who just bought the expensive house next door.
Pat, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you, Liz. You know, the title of your podcast, New Hampshire Has Issues. You have an endless supply of issues to talk about.
There are so many issues. If I've learned one major thing today, it's that even when I think I kind of understand an issue, we go 8 layers deeper, and it's like, oh no, it's way worse than I thought it was. Every issue comes with its acronyms. If I'm going to publish a book, it's going to be the New Hampshire Has Issues acronym guide. Here is your guide to acronyms for housing, for education, for disability rights. Like everybody's got an acronym, so don't you worry.
Please do. That would be a bestseller.
That's right. It'll be #1 New York Times bestseller. What are the acronyms that you hear in New Hampshire Has Issues?